Sarah Martinez adjusted her flight attendant scarf one final time before the boarding announcement echoed through Terminal C. Flight 847 to Denver was just another Tuesday evening departure, the kind she had managed hundreds of times before. At 28, she had been working for Southwest Airlines for 6 years, long enough to handle difficult passengers, turbulence, and even medical emergencies with practiced calm. Tonight felt no different as she watched travelers shuffle toward the gate, dragging their carry-on bags and checking their phones. The Boeing 737 sat waiting on the tarmac, its blue and orange livery gleaming under the airport lights. Sarah had already completed her pre-flight safety checks, ensuring the emergency equipment was properly stocked and the cabin was ready for the 180 passengers who would soon fill every seat. The flight was completely booked, a mix of business travelers heading home and families returning from vacation. She recognized the usual types: the businessman in seat 4A who would request extra coffee, the mother in 12B traveling alone with twin toddlers, and the elderly couple in 23C and D who always held hands during takeoff. As passengers began filing aboard, Sarah greeted each one with her standard warm smile and helpful directions to their seats. The boarding process moved smoothly until about halfway through, when she noticed a commotion near the gate. A tall man in civilian clothes was having what appeared to be an intense conversation with the gate agent. Even from her position at the aircraft door, Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders and the way he kept glancing around as if expecting trouble. The man finally boarded, presenting a last-minute ticket that had been processed just minutes before departure. He was probably in his early 30s, with short cropped hair and the kind of posture that suggested military training. His clothes were wrinkled as if he had been traveling for days, and there was something about his eyes that made Sarah look twice. They held a weariness that went deeper than simple fatigue, the kind she had seen in her brother when he returned from his deployment overseas. He took his seat in 18F, the window seat in the emergency exit row, without making eye contact with anyone. Most passengers in that row asked about the extra legroom, or made small talk about the responsibilities that came with sitting there. But this man simply buckled his seatbelt and stared out the small window. Sarah made a mental note to check on him during the flight, something about his demeanor triggering her instinct to keep watch. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their departure time and the weather conditions in Denver. Sarah and her colleague Jessica began their safety demonstration, going through the familiar routine of oxygen masks, seatbelts, and emergency exits. During this time, she noticed the man in 18F was not paying attention to the demonstration at all. Instead, he seemed to be scanning the cabin, his gaze moving methodically from row to row as if cataloging every face and exit point. As they taxied toward the runway, Sarah felt the familiar excitement that still came with each takeoff. Even after all these years, flying never got old for her, and she loved the moment when the aircraft lifted off the ground and climbed into the evening sky. The city lights grew smaller below them as they gained altitude, and she prepared for what she expected would be a routine 3-hour flight to Denver. About 30 minutes into the flight, once they had reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign was turned off, Sarah began her beverage service. She started from the front of the plane, working her way back with the cart, taking orders and making small talk with passengers. The businessman wanted his usual coffee, black with 2 sugars. The mother with the twins needed help opening juice boxes and cleaning up after a small spill. The elderly couple requested tea and spent the time telling her about their grandchildren in Colorado. When she reached row 18, Sarah noticed something was wrong immediately. The man in the window seat was pale, much more so than when he had boarded. Beads of sweat dotted his forehead despite the cool cabin temperature, and his breathing seemed labored. His left hand was pressed against his side, and she could see him trying to hide obvious discomfort. "Sir, can I get you something to drink?" she asked, keeping her voice light and professional while studying his face more carefully. He looked up at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her stomach clench. Pain, yes, but also a kind of alert wariness that suggested he was fighting to stay conscious. "Just water," he managed, his voice hoarse. Sarah handed him the plastic cup, noticing that his hand shook slightly as he took it. As he reached for the water, his jacket fell open slightly, and she caught a glimpse of something that made her breath catch. Dark stains on his shirt that looked suspiciously like dried blood. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked quietly, leaning closer so other passengers could not hear. The man met her eyes directly for the first time since boarding. "I'm fine," he said, but the way he said it told her he was anything but fine. There was something almost desperate in his voice, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as her. Sarah had been trained to handle medical emergencies, but something about this situation felt different. This was not a typical case of air sickness or anxiety. The man's alertness despite his obvious physical distress, the way he continued to scan the cabin even while clearly in pain, and most importantly, those stains on his shirt all pointed to something more serious than a routine medical issue. She made a decision to keep a closer eye on him as she continued with her service duties. Whatever was happening with this passenger, she had a feeling this would not be the routine flight she had expected when she had clocked in for work that evening. The aircraft continued its steady journey westward through the darkening sky, but Sarah's attention kept returning to the mysterious man in 18F, wondering what story lay behind his obvious distress and why he seemed so determined to hide it. Little did she know that the next few hours would test every bit of training she had ever received and introduce her to a world she had only seen in movies. The wounded stranger in the emergency exit row was about to turn her routine Tuesday evening into something that would change both of their lives forever. Sarah completed the beverage service, but her mind kept drifting back to the passenger in 18F. During her 6 years of flying, she had developed a sixth sense about people, an ability to read passengers that had served her well in countless situations. Something about this man was different, and the more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that he needed help, whether he wanted to admit it or not. She found an excuse to walk through the cabin again, ostensibly checking on passengers but really wanting another look at the mysterious man. As she approached row 18, she noticed his condition had worsened. His breathing was more shallow and he had shifted in his seat, pressing his left side more firmly against the window. The plastic water cup sat untouched on his tray table and his eyes were closed, though she could tell by the tension in his face that he was not sleeping. "Excuse me," she said softly, stopping beside his row. "I wanted to check if you needed anything else." His eyes opened immediately and she was struck again by how alert they remained, despite his obvious physical distress. This was not someone who was simply ill, she realized. This was someone who was injured but fighting to stay conscious and aware of his surroundings. "I'm okay," he repeated, but this time his voice was weaker. She noticed he was careful not to move his left arm or shift his torso when he spoke. Sarah made a decision that went against protocol. Instead of alerting the captain immediately or asking if there was a doctor on board, she crouched down beside his seat, bringing herself to his eye level and lowering her voice so that nearby passengers could not hear. "Look, I can see that you're hurt," she said quietly. "I don't know what happened or why you don't want help, but I've been doing this job long enough to know when someone is in serious trouble. You have blood on your shirt, you're pale as a sheet, and you're obviously in pain. Let me help you." For a long moment he just stared at her and she could see him weighing his options. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Marcus Reed, I'm Navy SEAL, and I'm coming back from a classified operation that went wrong." He paused, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "I took shrapnel in my left side 3 days ago. I've been trying to get home without drawing attention, but I think one of the fragments may have shifted during takeoff." Sarah felt her heart rate increase. She had suspected he was military, but a Navy SEAL on a classified mission was beyond anything she had imagined. "You need medical attention," she said. "We can have paramedics waiting when we land." Marcus shook his head firmly. No authorities, no hospitals, no reports. There are people who might be watching for someone matching my description. I just need to get to Denver quietly and contact my handler." "But you could be bleeding internally," Sarah protested. "If that shrapnel moved, you could be in serious danger." "I know the risks," Marcus replied, though she could see the worry in his eyes. "I've dealt with worse injuries in the field. I can make it to Denver if I can just rest and maybe get something to help with the pain." Sarah found herself in an impossible position. Every part of her training said she should alert the captain and request medical assistance immediately. But looking at this man, seeing the genuine fear in his eyes when he talked about drawing attention, she found herself wanting to help him on his terms. "I can't give you prescription medication," she said carefully, "but I might have something in the first aid kit that could help, and I can try to make you more comfortable." Marcus looked at her with something approaching gratitude. "Why would you help me? You don't know me, and what I'm asking could get you in trouble." Sarah thought about that for a moment. Her younger brother had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and she had seen firsthand how difficult it could be for soldiers to readjust to civilian life, especially after difficult missions. More than that, there was something about Marcus that made her want to trust him. Despite his obvious pain and exhaustion, he maintained a quiet dignity and spoke with the kind of honesty that was hard to fake. "Because you asked me to," she said simply, "and because I think you're telling me the truth." She excused herself and made her way to the galley where Jessica was organizing supplies for the snack service. Sarah pulled out the aircraft's medical kit and quickly inventoried its contents. There were basic pain relievers, bandages, antiseptic wipes, and other supplies that might help, but nothing strong enough to deal with what she suspected were serious injuries. "Everything okay?" Jessica asked, noticing Sarah's focused attention on the medical supplies. "Just reviewing our supplies," Sarah replied, not entirely lying. "Want to make sure we're prepared if anything comes up." She gathered what she thought might be useful and made her way back to Marcus. The cabin lights had been dimmed for the evening flight, giving her more privacy to help him without drawing attention from other passengers. She handed him several over-the-counter pain relievers and a bottle of water. "This is the strongest thing I can give you without a doctor's order," she said, "but I also brought some other supplies that might help." Marcus took the medication gratefully and managed to swallow the pills despite his obvious discomfort. "Thank you," he said. "I know this is asking a lot." Sarah looked around to ensure no one was watching, then leaned closer. "Can you show me where you're hurt? I have some basic first aid training and maybe I can help stabilize whatever is going on until we land." Marcus hesitated, then carefully unbuttoned his shirt partway, revealing a field dressing that had been hastily applied over what was clearly a significant wound. Even in the dim cabin lighting, Sarah could see that fresh blood had soaked through the bandage, and the skin around it was inflamed and discolored. "Dear God," she whispered, fighting to keep her expression neutral. "How have you been managing this for 3 days?" "Very carefully," Marcus replied with a weak attempt at humor. "I've had worse, but I'll admit this one is testing my limits." Sarah realized she was looking at injuries that were far beyond her ability to treat properly, but she also understood that Marcus believed he had no choice but to handle this quietly. She made a decision that went against everything she had been taught about protocol and proper procedures. "Okay," she said quietly, "I'm going to help you get through this flight, but when we land, you have to promise me you'll get proper medical attention, handler or no handler." Marcus nodded, and she could see the relief in his eyes at having someone, anyone who was willing to help him carry this burden. Neither of them realized that their problems were about to get much more complicated, and that the simple act of compassion was about to thrust them both into a situation that would test everything they thought they knew about trust, duty, and survival. Sarah worked as discreetly as possible to help Marcus, using the airplane's limited resources to clean and redress his wound. The shrapnel wound was worse than she had initially thought, but she managed to apply fresh bandages and antiseptic without drawing attention from other passengers. Marcus endured the impromptu medical care with the stoic silence she was beginning to expect from him, though she could see the strain in his jaw and the way his knuckles went white when she had to apply pressure to stop the bleeding. "The good news is that I don't think you're bleeding internally," she whispered, as she secured the new dressing. "The bad news is that this wound needs proper stitches and probably antibiotics. You're showing early signs of infection." Marcus nodded, pulling his shirt back into place with careful movements. "I know. I was hoping to make it to my contact in Denver before it got too bad, but the pain got worse after takeoff. Something about the pressure changes, maybe." Sarah was about to respond when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. 2 rows ahead, a man in a business suit had turned in his seat and was looking directly at them. It might have been innocent curiosity about why the flight attendant was spending so much time with one passenger, but something about his intense stare made her uncomfortable. When their eyes met, he quickly looked away, but not before she caught something in his expression that seemed far more interested than a typical passenger should be. "Don't look now," she said quietly to Marcus, "but I think someone might be watching us." Marcus's entire demeanor changed instantly. The casual alertness she had noticed earlier sharpened into something much more focused and dangerous. Without appearing to move his head, his eyes swept the cabin in a way that told her he was cataloging every face and assessing every potential threat. Gray suit, 2 rows up, aisle seat, he said after a moment. It was not a question. You saw him too? I've been watching him since we boarded. He was one of the last passengers on the plane, and he's been checking his phone every few minutes since takeoff. That's unusual behavior at cruising altitude. Marcus paused, his expression growing more serious. Sarah, I need you to listen to me carefully. If that man is who I think he might be, then we could both be in danger. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean? Who do you think he is? The operation I was on went bad because someone leaked our position to the enemy. 3 of my team members were killed, and I barely made it out alive. My commanding officer thinks there might be a mole in our organization, someone feeding information to hostile forces. If they tracked me to this flight, they might try to finish what they started. The implications of what Marcus was saying hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had thought she was simply helping an injured soldier get home safely. Now she was realizing she might be in the middle of something much more dangerous and complex. What should we do? She asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Act normal. Continue with your regular duties, but keep an eye on that man. If he gets up or makes any moves toward this part of the plane, I need to know immediately. Marcus's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. And Sarah, if something does happen, get as far away from me as possible. I don't want you getting hurt because you tried to help me. Sarah shook her head firmly. I'm not abandoning you now. If you're right about this, you're in no condition to handle a confrontation on your own. You don't understand what you're dealing with, Marcus said urgently. These people don't hesitate to hurt innocent bystanders if it serves their purpose. Your best chance of staying safe is to distance yourself from me. Before Sarah could respond, she heard the chime that indicated a passenger was calling for assistance. The call light was coming from the man in the gray suit. Sarah felt her heart rate spike, but she forced herself to maintain her professional composure. I have to go, she whispered to Marcus, but I'm not running away. She walked toward the front of the plane, stopping at the gray-suited man's seat. Up close, she could see that he was probably in his 40s, with the kind of unremarkable appearance that would make him easy to overlook in a crowd. But his eyes were sharp and calculating, and when he smiled at her, it did not reach those eyes. I was wondering if I could get another coffee, he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Sarah could not quite place. Of course, she replied, maintaining her professional smile while studying his face. Would you like cream and sugar with that? Black is fine. He paused, then added, I noticed you've been spending a lot of time with the passenger in 18F. Is everything all right? He looked like he might be feeling unwell. Sarah felt alarm bells going off in her head. Passengers occasionally expressed concern about other travelers, but something about the way this man asked the question felt wrong. There was too much interest, too much focus on Marcus specifically. All of our passengers are doing fine, thank you for your concern, she replied diplomatically. I'll get that coffee for you right away. As she turned to leave, the man caught her arm gently. You know, if someone on this plane were seriously ill, it would be a shame if they didn't get the help they needed. Sometimes trying to handle medical emergencies alone can have tragic consequences. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Sarah pulled her arm free and maintained her smile through sheer force of will. As I said, all of our passengers are fine. I'll be right back with your coffee. She walked to the galley on unsteady legs, her mind racing. The man had not only confirmed that he was watching Marcus, but he had also implied that he knew Marcus was injured. Worse, his comment about tragic consequences sounded like a thinly veiled threat. Jessica was restocking supplies in the galley when Sarah arrived. You look like you've seen a ghost, her colleague observed. What's going on? Sarah realized she was faced with another impossible decision. She could not tell Jessica the truth without potentially putting her in danger too, but she also realized she might need help if the situation escalated. The aircraft was still more than an hour away from Denver, and if the man in the gray suit was planning something, she and Marcus would need all the advantages they could get. I think we might have a problem passenger, she said carefully. The man in 14C has been asking unusual questions about other travelers. I want to keep an eye on him. Jessica nodded. Problem passengers were part of the job, and flight attendants were trained to work together to handle difficult situations. Want me to take over the service for that section? No, I can handle it. But if you see anything unusual, let me know immediately. Sarah prepared the coffee, using the time to think through her options. When she returned to the man in the gray suit, she found him typing something on his phone. He looked up when she approached, accepting the coffee with that same unsettling smile. "Thank you," he said. "I hope the rest of the flight goes smoothly for everyone involved." As Sarah walked back toward Marcus, she realized that the next hour would test her in ways she had never imagined. She was no longer just a flight attendant trying to help an injured passenger. She was now part of something much larger and more dangerous, and she had no idea how to keep herself and Marcus safe until they could reach the ground. Sarah made her way back to Marcus, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. The conversation with the man in the gray suit had confirmed her worst fears, and she could see from Marcus's expression that he had been watching the entire interaction. "He knows you're hurt," she whispered as she stopped beside his seat, pretending to check his seatbelt for the benefit of any observers. "He asked specifically about you and made what sounded like a threat about medical emergencies having tragic consequences." Marcus's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Then we need to assume this is a hostile situation. Sarah, I need you to listen carefully. In about 10 minutes, I want you to announce that you're doing a routine safety check of the emergency exits. When you get to this row, I'm going to need you to help me access the emergency equipment stored near this seat." "What kind of equipment?" she asked, though she was not sure she wanted to know the answer. "Emergency axes, flashlights, anything that could be used defensively if necessary. If this man is who I think he is, he'll probably make his move sometime in the next 30 minutes. While we're still far from any airport where the pilot might consider an emergency landing." Sarah felt her stomach clench with fear, but she also felt a strange sense of determination. She had committed to helping Marcus, and she was not going to back down now, even if the situation had escalated far beyond what she had originally bargained for. "There's something else," she said. "I think there might be a second person involved. When I was getting his coffee, I noticed a woman in 8A who kept looking back toward your seat. She's been reading the same magazine page for 20 minutes, but her eyes keep moving toward the back of the plane." Marcus processed this information with the kind of quick analysis she was beginning to expect from him. 2 operatives on a commercial flight means this is a serious extraction attempt. They probably planned to wait until we landed, but my condition might have forced them to accelerate their timeline. "Extraction attempt?" Sarah asked, though she was afraid she already knew what that meant. "They want to take me alive, probably for interrogation about the failed mission and what I might know about the mole in our organization. The problem is they can't just grab me off a commercial aircraft without creating a massive scene. Unless—" Marcus paused, his expression growing more serious. "Unless they're planning to create some kind of emergency situation that would justify removing an injured passenger from the plane." Sarah felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, and she did not like the picture they formed. "You mean they might try to make it look like you need immediate medical attention?" "That would be the cleanest approach. Stage some kind of medical crisis, insist that I need to be taken off the plane immediately for emergency treatment, and then disappear me once we're away from witnesses." The implications of what Marcus was suggesting made Sarah's blood run cold. She had unknowingly walked into the middle of what was essentially a kidnapping attempt at 35,000 feet, with nowhere to run and limited options for getting help. "What can we do?" she asked, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "We need to make sure that if they try to stage a medical emergency, there are too many witnesses for them to control the situation," Marcus replied, "and we need to be ready to defend ourselves if they decide to abandon subtlety altogether." Sarah glanced around the cabin, looking at the other passengers with new eyes. The businessman in 4A was asleep with his laptop open. The mother with the twins was dealing with a minor meltdown from one of her children. The elderly couple was sharing a crossword puzzle. None of them had any idea that they might be about to witness something that would traumatize them for years to come. "I should tell the captain," Sarah said, though even as she said it, she realized the problems with that approach. "And tell him what? That I'm a Navy SEAL being hunted by foreign operatives based on nothing but suspicious behavior from passengers who haven't actually done anything yet? He'll think you're having some kind of breakdown, and that will just create more chaos." Marcus was right, and Sarah hated that he was right. Without concrete evidence of a threat, any attempt to raise an alarm would likely backfire and actually help their enemies by creating confusion and distraction. "Then what's our plan?" she asked. "We stay alert. We stay together when possible. And we make sure that if something happens, it happens in front of as many people as possible. These operatives are professionals, which means they'll try to avoid creating a scene that could be traced back to them later. Sarah was about to respond when she heard the chime indicating another passenger call. This time the light was coming from the woman in 8A, the same woman she had noticed watching them earlier. "I have to go," she whispered to Marcus, "but I'll be back as soon as I can." "Be careful," Marcus replied. "And remember, if this goes bad, your priority is getting yourself to safety." Sarah made her way forward, her heart pounding with each step. The woman in 8A was younger than the man in the gray suit, probably in her 30s, with short dark hair and an athletic build that suggested she kept herself in excellent physical condition. When Sarah reached her seat, the woman looked up with a smile that seemed more genuine than the man's had been. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said in lightly accented English, "but I think there might be a problem with one of the other passengers. The man a few rows behind me looks like he might be seriously ill. I have some medical training and I'm concerned he might need immediate attention." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Here it was, exactly what Marcus had predicted. They were starting to build their case for a medical emergency, probably planning to have both operatives help with the situation and then insist that Marcus needed to be taken off the plane immediately. "Which passenger are you referring to?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "The man in 18F. He's been very pale and seems to be having trouble breathing. As someone with medical experience, I really think he should be evaluated immediately." Sarah realized she was at a critical decision point. How she responded to this woman would determine whether the operatives could proceed with their plan or whether they would have to try something more desperate and potentially more dangerous. "Thank you for your concern," Sarah replied carefully. "I've been monitoring all of our passengers and everyone seems to be doing fine. But I'll certainly check on him again." The woman's smile faltered slightly. "I really think this might be more serious than you realize. Sometimes flight attendants don't have the medical background to recognize the signs of a real emergency." There it was, the pressure to hand over responsibility for Marcus's welfare to someone with supposed medical expertise. Sarah realized that her next words could either defuse the situation or escalate it dramatically. "I appreciate your offer to help," she said, "but our crew is trained to handle medical emergencies and we have protocols we need to follow. If there's a serious medical situation, we'll contact ground control and request assistance from any medical professionals on board through the proper channels." The woman's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "I see. Well, I hope for everyone's sake that you're making the right decision." As Sarah walked away, she realized that the battle lines had been drawn. The operatives now knew that she was not going to cooperate with their plan, which meant they would have to find another approach. Unfortunately, she had no idea what that approach might be, and she was running out of time to figure out how to keep herself and Marcus safe until they could reach Denver. Sarah returned to Marcus with a growing sense of urgency. The encounter with the woman in 8A had confirmed that they were dealing with a coordinated effort, and the operatives were clearly prepared to escalate their approach now that their initial plan had been thwarted. "She tried to get me to hand you over for medical evaluation," Sarah whispered as she knelt beside Marcus's seat. "When I refused, she wasn't happy about it. Then they'll move to phase 2, Marcus replied grimly. "They'll probably try to create some kind of distraction or emergency that forces the crew to focus elsewhere while they make their move." As if summoned by his words, a commotion erupted near the front of the aircraft. Sarah could hear raised voices and what sounded like someone in distress. Jessica's voice came over the intercom, asking if there were any medical professionals on board to assist with a passenger emergency. "That's their play," Marcus said quietly. "They're creating a medical emergency up front to draw attention away from this section of the plane." Classic misdirection. Sarah felt torn between her duty to assist with the emergency and her commitment to protecting Marcus. "I should go help Jessica," she said. "No," Marcus replied firmly. "That's exactly what they want. They're counting on your training and instincts to pull you away from me. The moment you leave, one or both of them will make their move." Sarah realized he was right, but the sounds of distress from the front of the plane were getting louder. She could hear Jessica trying to manage what sounded like a passenger having some kind of seizure or cardiac event. Every instinct she had developed over 6 years of flying told her to rush forward and help. But Marcus's warning kept her in place. "Is there anything we can do to help from back here?" she asked. "Yes, we can make sure that when they come for me, they have to do it in front of witnesses who are paying attention." Marcus shifted carefully in his seat. and Sarah could see him preparing for something. "I need you to do something that's going to seem strange, but trust me. I want you to announce that you're conducting an emergency safety inspection of this section of the aircraft." "What good will that do?" "It will force everyone in these rows to look up and pay attention to what's happening. If our friends try to grab me, they'll have to do it in front of a dozen people who are actively watching." Sarah nodded and raised her voice slightly, addressing the passengers in the surrounding rows. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be conducting a routine safety check of the emergency equipment in this section. This will only take a moment, but I ask for your attention to ensure we maintain our safety standards." The announcement had the desired effect. Passengers who had been dozing, reading, or watching movies looked up and focused on Sarah. She began going through the motions of checking emergency equipment, but her real purpose was to create an audience that would make it difficult for the operatives to act without being seen. That's when things went wrong, in a way none of them had anticipated. The man in the gray suit stood up suddenly and began walking toward the back of the plane. At the same time, the woman in 8A also rose from her seat. But instead of approaching Marcus directly, they positioned themselves to block both ends of the aisle near his row, effectively trapping him and Sarah in place. "Ladies and gentlemen," the man announced in a calm, authoritative voice, "I'm a federal air marshal, and we have a situation that requires your immediate cooperation." Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized how masterfully they had outmaneuvered her. By identifying himself as a federal air marshal, the man was instantly legitimizing whatever he was about to do. Passengers would naturally defer to his authority, and any resistance from Sarah or Marcus would look like they were interfering with federal law enforcement. "The passenger in 18F is wanted in connection with a national security matter," the man continued, pulling out what appeared to be official identification. "I need everyone to remain calm and stay in your seats while we handle this situation." Marcus looked at Sarah with resignation in his eyes. "They've played this perfectly," he whispered. "Even if these people suspect something is wrong, they're not going to interfere with what they think is a federal arrest." Sarah felt desperation rising in her chest. She could see the other passengers looking back and forth between the supposed air marshal and Marcus, clearly unsure what to think but inclined to trust the authority figure who had taken control of the situation. "Wait," she said, raising her voice so the other passengers could hear. "I need to see proper identification and speak with the captain before any passenger is removed from their seat during flight." The man in the gray suit smiled at her with what looked like genuine amusement. "Miss, I understand you're trying to do your job, but this is a federal matter. I don't need permission from the flight crew to apprehend a suspect." Sarah realized she was fighting a losing battle, but she could not give up without trying everything she could think of. "Then you won't mind if I verify your credentials with ground control," she said, hoping her voice sounded more confident than she felt. "Actually, I would mind," the man replied, his tone becoming colder. "This operation is classified, and I can't have you broadcasting sensitive information over open channels." That was when Marcus made his move. Despite his injuries, he suddenly lunged forward, grabbing the emergency axe from its mounting near the exit door. The movement clearly caused him significant pain, but it also caught both operatives off guard. "Everyone get down," Marcus shouted, holding the axe defensively while positioning himself between Sarah and the two supposed federal agents. "These people are not air marshals. They're foreign operatives trying to kidnap me." The cabin erupted in chaos. Passengers began screaming and diving for cover, not knowing who to believe or what was really happening. The woman who had been blocking the rear of the aisle immediately reached into her jacket, and Sarah caught a glimpse of what looked like a weapon before Marcus shoved her aside. "Sarah, get to the front of the plane and tell the captain to contact Denver Tower immediately," Marcus yelled over the noise. "Tell them we have a code red security situation and need emergency assistance on landing." The man in the gray suit was advancing on Marcus, no longer bothering to maintain his federal agent cover story. "Mr. Reed, you're making this much more difficult than it needs to be. Come with us quietly and no one else has to get hurt." "Not happening," Marcus replied, swinging the emergency axe in a defensive arc that forced the man to step back. Despite his obvious pain and weakness, Marcus moved with the fluid precision of someone who had been trained for exactly this type of close-quarters combat. Sarah realized she had a choice to make. She could follow Marcus's instructions and run for the cockpit, potentially leaving him to face two trained operatives alone while injured, or she could stay and try to help. even though she had no idea what she could actually do against professional killers. The decision was made for her when the woman operative stepped into the aisle behind Marcus, clearly intending to attack him from behind while he was focused on her partner. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed the nearest heavy object she could find, the beverage cart, and rammed it directly into the woman's legs. The woman stumbled but recovered quickly, turning toward Sarah with a look of cold fury. "You're making a serious mistake, flight attendant. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me now," Sarah replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. What happened next would be burned into Sarah's memory forever. The woman reached for what was definitely a weapon, but before she could draw it, Marcus spun around and struck her with the flat side of the emergency axe. The blow sent her sprawling into the seats, unconscious but still breathing. The man in the gray suit used the distraction to make his own move, lunging forward to tackle Marcus. Both men went down hard, fighting for control of the axe while passengers continued screaming and scrambling to get away from the violence. Sarah realized that Marcus, despite his training, was at a severe disadvantage due to his injuries. The wound in his side had reopened and she could see fresh blood soaking through his shirt. He was fighting on adrenaline and determination alone, and that would not last much longer. She made another split-second decision that went against every safety protocol she had ever learned. Instead of running for help, she grabbed the intercom handset and made an announcement that she hoped would save all their lives. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your flight attendant." The two people claiming to be federal agents are actually foreign operatives attempting to kidnap a United States Navy SEAL. "I need every able-bodied male passenger to come to row 18 immediately and help us. Restrain these individuals until we can land." For a moment there was silence except for the sounds of Marcus and the operative struggling on the floor. Then Sarah heard something that made her heart soar with relief. The sound of footsteps in the aisle as passengers began responding to her call for help. The businessman from 4A was the first to reach them, followed by two college-aged men who looked like they worked out regularly. Behind them came several other male passengers, including the elderly man from the couple in 23C, who was moving with surprising determination despite his age. "What do you need us to do?" the businessman asked, looking at the chaotic scene with wide eyes but clear resolve. "Help me separate them and restrain the attacker," Sarah replied, pointing to where Marcus and the gray-suited man were still fighting for control of the emergency axe. It took 4 passengers working together to safely separate the 2 men and pin the operative to the floor. Marcus collapsed against the seats, breathing heavily and clearly exhausted but alive and free. Sarah knelt beside him, checking his injuries while the passengers maintained their hold on the captured operative. "Are you okay?" she asked. Marcus looked up at her with something approaching amazement. "I can't believe you did that," he said. "You could have been killed." "So could you," Sarah replied. "And I wasn't going to let that happen on my plane." As the aircraft began its descent toward Denver, Sarah realized that her routine Tuesday evening had become something extraordinary. She had helped save a Navy SEAL, fought off foreign operatives, and discovered reserves of courage she never knew she possessed. More importantly, she had learned that sometimes doing the right thing meant throwing the rule book out the window and trusting your instincts about people. The hardest part, she realized, was still ahead of them. They had to land safely, turn the operatives over to the proper authorities, and somehow make sense of everything that had happened at 35,000 feet above the Colorado landscape. The descent into Denver International Airport was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her 6 years of flying. The cabin, which had been a scene of chaos and violence just minutes earlier, was now eerily quiet except for the low murmur of passengers discussing what they had witnessed. The 2 operatives were securely restrained in their seats, watched over by the volunteer passengers who had responded to Sarah's desperate call for help. Marcus had been moved to a seat in the front row, where Sarah could better monitor his condition. The fight had taken a serious toll on his already compromised health, and she was increasingly worried about the amount of blood he had lost. His face was pale and drawn, but his eyes remained alert as he spoke quietly with the captain, who had finally emerged from the cockpit to assess the situation. Captain Williams was a 20-year veteran of commercial aviation, but Sarah could see that even he was struggling to process everything that had happened on his aircraft. After speaking with Marcus and examining the restrained operatives, He had immediately contacted Denver Tower and requested priority landing with federal law enforcement standing by. "Sarah," the captain said, approaching her as she checked Marcus's bandages once again, "I need you to know that what you did tonight was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most reckless. Possibly both." "I know I broke protocol," Sarah replied, not looking up from her patient. "I'm prepared to accept whatever consequences come from that." Captain Williams shook his head. "You saved lives tonight. That Navy SEAL would probably be dead or disappeared if you hadn't acted when you did. The company will have questions and there will be investigations. But you did the right thing." As the aircraft touched down at Denver International, Sarah could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles through the small windows. Fire trucks, ambulances, and what looked like an entire fleet of federal law enforcement vehicles were positioned along the runway. The sight was both reassuring and overwhelming. The landing was smooth, but Sarah's hands were shaking as she prepared for whatever was going to happen next. She had no experience with situations like this and no idea what protocols existed for turning over foreign operatives who had attempted a kidnapping at cruising altitude. "Sarah?" Marcus called weakly from his seat. She moved to his side, noting that his color was getting worse despite her efforts to stabilize his condition. "What is it?" she asked. "When we get off this plane, everything is going to get very complicated very quickly. Federal agents will want to debrief both of us, probably separately. There will be questions about the classified operation, about how these people found me, about everything that happened up there." He paused, struggling to catch his breath. "I want you to know that none of this was your fault, and I'm going to make sure everyone understands that you're a hero, not someone who interfered with a federal operation." Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time since the ordeal had begun. "I was just doing my job," she said. "No," Marcus replied firmly. "Your job was to serve beverages and make sure people buckled their seatbelts. What you did went far beyond that, and I'll never forget it." The aircraft came to a stop at a remote gate away from the normal passenger terminal. Through the windows, Sarah could see agents in tactical gear approaching the plane. The next few hours were going to be a whirlwind of debriefings, medical examinations, and paperwork. But for the moment, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had trusted her instincts about Marcus, and that trust had saved his life. The door opened, and federal agents boarded the aircraft with military precision. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with short gray hair and an authoritative manner, immediately took control of the situation. "I'm Special Agent Rebecca Morrison, FBI," she announced. "I need everyone to remain seated while we secure the suspects and get medical attention for the injured." Paramedics rushed to Marcus's side, and Sarah was relieved to see him finally getting the professional medical care he had needed for days. As they worked to stabilize him for transport, he caught her eye one more time. "Thank you," he said simply. The operatives were removed from the aircraft in handcuffs, still maintaining their silence but no longer bothering with their cover identities. The passengers who had helped restrain them were taken aside for initial interviews, and Sarah could see the mixture of excitement and shock on their faces as they realized they had been part of something that would likely make national news. "Agent." Morrison approached Sarah as the last of the operatives was led away. "Ms. Martinez, I need you to come with me for debriefing. This is going to take a while, but I want you to know that preliminary reports suggest you prevented a serious national security incident tonight." Sarah nodded, gathering her crew bag and preparing to leave the aircraft that had been her workplace and briefly her battlefield. As she walked down the aisle, several passengers stopped her to express their gratitude and amazement at what she had done. The businessman from 4A shook her hand firmly. "I've never seen anything like that," he said. "You saved that man's life." The elderly gentleman who had helped restrain the operatives patted her shoulder gently. "My grandson is in the military," he said quietly. "Thank you for looking out for one of our boys." 3 hours later, Sarah sat in a conference room at the Denver FBI field office, having answered what felt like 1,000 questions about everything that had happened, from the moment Marcus boarded the flight until the aircraft landed. Agent Morrison had been thorough but respectful, clearly understanding that Sarah was a victim of circumstance who had risen to meet an extraordinary challenge. "The operatives you helped capture tonight were part of a sophisticated intelligence network that has been trying to locate Petty Officer Reed for weeks," Agent Morrison explained. "The classified operation he was involved in disrupted a major arms smuggling ring, and these people wanted him eliminated before he could testify about what he learned." Is he going to be okay? Sarah asked, the question that had been foremost in her mind throughout the entire debriefing. He's in surgery now, but the doctors are optimistic. You did an excellent job of keeping him stable under impossible circumstances. Without your first aid, he probably wouldn't have survived long enough to get proper medical treatment. Agent Morrison closed her folder and looked at Sarah with something approaching admiration. Ms. Martinez, I've been doing this job for 20 years, and I've rarely seen a civilian show the kind of courage and quick thinking you displayed tonight. You should be very proud of what you accomplished. As Sarah finally walked out of the FBI building into the early morning Denver sunshine, she felt emotionally and physically drained but also strangely exhilarated. Her quiet life as a flight attendant had been turned upside down in the space of a few hours, but she had discovered something about herself that she never could have learned in any other way. 2 weeks later, Sarah was back on duty, flying the same route from Phoenix to Denver. The story had indeed made national news, and she had received commendations from her airline, the Department of Defense, and even a personal letter from the Secretary of the Navy. But more importantly to her, she had received a message from Marcus letting her know that he was recovering well and would be returning to active duty soon as her new flight reached cruising altitude and she began the familiar routine of beverage service. Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that Tuesday evening. She looked at each passenger differently now, wondering about their stories and whether any of them might need help that went beyond peanuts and coffee. When she reached the emergency exit row, she paused for a moment, remembering the wounded SEAL who had stumbled before her and changed her life forever. She had learned that sometimes the most important part of her job had nothing to do with airline procedures or customer service. Sometimes it was simply about recognizing when another human being needed help and having the courage to provide it, regardless of the personal cost. Sarah smiled and continued with her service, ready for whatever challenges her next flight might bring. She had faced foreign operatives at 35,000 feet and emerged victorious. After that, she figured she could handle just about anything,